the co-pilot, the tech rabbi for today. And thank you. And so we're going to get started. So Alexandra, so friends, if you want to put your view on speaker view, I think you're going to see our speaker, Miri, and myself for a little while with Rabbi Stein. And I'm just going to say a little bit of, that's me, okay. Again, welcome. This is a great time, if you don't mind, to please put yourself on mute. I'd like to say a word about the unfolding of the program, about how it is part of a larger series, and how you could participate this morning as well. So first of all, thank you for being part of this summer Limmud. Miri, every year we do something called summer Limmud on a theme, 4 or 5 sessions, usually in person, this year different, where we study something in great depth. And this year we're studying Israel and Zionism, our relationship to Israel. And the ultimate goal is to figure out how we can continue to stay connected to ideas of kind of our support and our relationship with Israel, which is what Zionism is. So as many of you know, this is number 3 of a 4-part series. And the series will end next Sunday with our only in-person session with Rabbi Josh Weinberg, the director of ARTSA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America, where he too will explore, like, what does it mean to be a Reform Jew in relationship to Israel, and in our vision and perhaps struggle with ideas of Zionism. So building up to that, I'm going to say a few words in a minute or two about our speaker, about the relationship between the Knesset and the Supreme Court and the role of the Supreme Court. However, we have begun each of these sessions with the clergy host saying a word or two about our own relationship to Israel. So I thought I'd just, in 60 seconds or more, when I graduated high school, my parents offered me, as they did my brothers, a special gift. And the gift I wanted was to go to Israel. And so in the winter break of my freshman year in college, I traveled to Israel. It was 1981. And Israel was so different than it is today. But it was a great trip, despite the fact that it was a particularly cold and rainy winter. And thus began what has been for me over 20 trips to Israel, including living in Israel in 1985 and 1986 as I prepared for my journey to the rabbinate with my time at HUC. I have loved traveling and living in Israel. This year, before the trip that I hosted where we met Miri in March, and many of you were on that trip, it was a first-timers trip. For the first time, I wondered, as we sort of organized the trip and as I headed out with the group, whether there would be a time, because of what's happening in Israel today, when I might think that I might not want to do a trip to Israel. Would there be a time when I would actually stop travel to Israel? This was in my mind, really, for the first time. And I want to tell you, and for those of you who are my co-travelers, when I was there, all those thoughts were erased. I really feel very challenged by the current situation, that this is not the Israel to which I am connected, want to be connected. The aspirations of Israel and a Jewish state are not being lived out right now in the current government, certainly in past governments as well, but I had much more hope. But when I was in Israel with all of you, with many of you, the experience affirmed my commitment to continue to be in relationship with Israel, both for what it offers me as a Jew, independent of politics. I love bringing Israel to other people and watching sort of it take root as it has in me in unique ways, whether it's culture or archaeology, spirituality, whatever it might be. And there's no question that happened on my last trip, despite my feelings that maybe this current situation would put too much distance between myself and Israel. And it didn't happen. And I felt really all the more committed to working, as Miri, you are, to bring Israel to a place of greater morality and Jewish ethics. With that, I end my own personal words, and I introduce you to Miri Yasaf, who I met in March, who works for the Reform movement at the organization called the Israel Religious Action Center. Many of us know the Religious Action Center here in Washington. It has a partner called IRAC, the Israel Religious Action Center, where Miri has worked since 2014. She is a lawyer who graduated from Hebrew University, both as an undergraduate and received her degree in law from that place. She works in the field of civil rights and particularly law cases against the government. She litigates cases regarding discrimination against women, bias issues, segregation issues. She also has worked diligently for issues that are unique to the Reform movement. She appears at the Knesset committee regarding legislation on all these topics and issues that we're struggling with and Israel is struggling with right now. She's one of us. She grew up as a member of the Reform movement in Israel, a member of Congregation Kol Hanshama, which our group also visited and many groups have visited. She is married and has 3 wonderful kids who are on summer break right now, which is nice. And really, to me, one of her greatest claims to fame is that she just taught us so much in our March trip. On our March trip, we spent a long morning at the Supreme Court. Our group had 2 presenters, and Miri was one of them. So half of us learned a tremendous amount from Miri, her experience as a lawyer and as a person very involved in the Supreme Court and issues of social justice. And as soon as we were imagining this series, which Rabbi Stein really is she's sort of the doula of this series. Thank you, Rabbi Stein. I said Miri has to be here. Miri is going to continue to teach our community. So I welcome you now, Miri. I thank you for giving up your Sunday afternoon, which is a work day in Israel, by the way. But thank you for giving us the time. And what's going to happen here? Oh, one last bit of technical information. If you have a question you would like Miri to respond to, would you please put it into the general chat? Rabbi Stein and I are going to be watching these questions. We're going to try and group them so that we don't have too many repetitive questions. And it would be easiest if you just put it in the chat to everyone, and we're going to work to ask as many themed questions as we can. And if you have any other more personal technical things and you want to private chat us, that would work too. Probably won't work to private chat Miri because she's busy with the presentation. Rabbi Stein, is there more I missed here? Please, over to you.
No, that's what I came in here to say. We're so happy you're here. Please don't private chat Miri. She won't see it. But you can do so to Miri Rabbi Schwartzman, and Miri, we're so happy you're here.
Okay, we're going to now give Miri the floor. And I think Miri is going to speak for the better part of 30 plus minutes, maybe. And then the rest of our time is going to be questions. Thank you, Miri.
So thank you, Rabbi Stein. Thank you, Rabbi Schwartzman, for having me. And thank you for all of you joining this Zoom today. And it's a pleasure being here. And I have very fond memories of seeing some of you at the Supreme Court in March. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'll start by a brief introduction of IRAC, which has been working for the past 36 years to keep the Jewish state a democracy, to protect human rights for all citizens in Israel. And we've been working to promote freedom of religion and equality of all the liberal streams in Israel. We fight for human rights, for women's rights, for LGBTQ rights. We have an anti-racism division at IRAC. We have a legal department and a public policy department, which I'll explain to you in depth during this presentation, the things we do. And I think I was asked to give an overview and explain about the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Knesset, and of course I'll address all the issues in politics that we're dealing with today in Israel, and I'll do that. But I thought I'd start with a small story, which I think kind of embodies everything that we're going through in Israel in the past year since the elections and through the legal coup. The legal revolution that the government is trying to impose by speed legislation. And so I'll start by sharing a story. In 2018, a woman was visiting her elderly father in the hospital. It was Passover, it was March, and he was a terminal patient. And the only thing he could eat was liquid, was the soups she would make him and bring to him, the smoothies, like health smoothies, health shakes that she would prepare at home and bring to the hospital. And it was Passover, and she had these smoothies in her bag. And she goes into the hospital, she walks into the hospital, and she goes through a security check. Like, as many of you probably know, I've been to Israel, a lot of places. Also, hospitals have security checks with security guards, where basically the aim is to see that people aren't carrying weapons or firearms. So she goes through this security check, and he opens her bag and he finds the food, and he takes the food and he confiscates it, and he says, "This isn't kosher for Pesach, it's Passover, you can't bring food from home." And he takes the food and he throws it away. And so this was one story. And during 2018, we kept hearing more and more stories from different hospitals in Israel during Passover, where food was being confiscated from family and friends who came to visit women who just gave birth, terminal patients, children that were hospitalized. And basically, family members couldn't prepare food at home and bring food to their loved ones. And it didn't matter if these people were Jewish and kept a kosher home, or they were Christian, Muslim patients, Arab patients, which basically obviously do not observe Passover. And the halakha, the Jewish law, doesn't regard them. Hospitals were prohibiting bringing in chametz into the hospital. And more so, they were using the authority of these security guards to check bags of people and check in their belongings. Now, immediately we understood that this is illegal. They have no authority in the law to check for food in your bags. And so there was an appeal to the Supreme Court. And basically, the petition said it was by members of family who felt that their rights were infringed upon, and members of Knesset. And they appealed against the government and against the Ministry of Health, and against these hospitals, saying that the security guards had no legal authority to run these checks and confiscate food, saying that there's an infringement on the freedom of religion, the right to autonomy, dignity, and equal rights for both Jewish patients and Arab, Muslim, Christian patients who don't even observe Passover, and this being, forcing them to observe halakha when actually there's no reason to. The Supreme Court decided in March last year that this was a illegal practice, and that the security guards were acting with no legal authority, and basically that was the ruling of the court. They said, because this is such a dire infringement on human rights, the autonomy to choose how to live my life, in what way to practice my Judaism, if to observe Passover, if not, what I eat, because this was such a dire infringement, they said, if the legislator wants to give, the Knesset, the legislator, the parliament, wants to give security guards the authority to check in people's bags, this has to be passed in a law, in main legislation, just like in the Kotel, in the Western Wall, they're not allowed to search for Torah scrolls when you come in, and they're supposed to let you in with a Torah scroll, even if you're a woman. It's kind of the same thing. So what happened? I don't think that in 2022, when this ruling came out, the judges even thought in their wildest dreams that this would be one of the first laws that the legislator legislated in the new Knesset with the new government. So in March 23, I was at the Knesset Health Committee, where they legislate, legislation that supposed to regard health. The fact that, for instance, there are not enough doctors, not enough beds in hospitals. There are a lot of burning issues that they could address, but what they decided to address was the Supreme Court ruling in the previous year. And they decided that in Pesach 2023, it would be prohibited and no one would be allowed to bring in chametz. And so it actually says so on the bill of this legislation, of this legislation. It says that because the court ruled against it, now they're legislating and it will be prohibited. And even though it's an infringement on human rights, this is going to go through. And sadly, it did go through. It went through. In Israel, you have to vote 3 times in the Knesset. I'll elaborate about that shortly. It passed 3 votes, and this past Pesach, you weren't allowed, not only you weren't allowed, they also searched bags for chametz. And so I think that story kind of encompasses the tension between Israel being a democracy and a Jewish state. I'll just say one more thing before I dive in, that in Israel during the high holidays, during Yom Kippur, when people are praying or in synagogue or fasting, there's no law saying you can't drive on the road. But if you'll go out, if anyone has been here during Yom Kippur, during the high holidays, there's not a car on the road. And this is because there's a deep respect for people's religion, but it isn't because the government imposes halakha rules, because it's supposed to be a democracy. It's supposed to be a liberal democracy, which is also a Jewish state. But we see how, I think this is a very good example, what I told you now about the chametz, is how the government wants to impose these rules, infringing upon people's human rights for autonomy and other rights. And through all this talk and everything I'll explain to you today, I think the point being is that all this speed legislation is infringing upon women's rights, minority rights, Arab rights, LGBTQ rights. And this is a government who's basically declared war on our values as a democracy. So having said that, I'll dive in. And I think I'll talk for about 30 minutes. I'll keep track of time, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. So when the state of Israel was established, they declared the scroll of independence. We don't have a constitution. We have the Declaration of Independence, which promised equal rights to all residents and inhabitants of the land. And basically they said that the state of Israel, I'm reading to you from the declaration, will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. And we have to take in mind while reading this that when Israel was established in 48, there were other inhabitants. There were Palestinians, there were Arab Israelis, which became part of the state of Israel. And so it's very interesting to see that our founding fathers, they were fathers and not mothers, but our founding fathers did believe in equal rights for everyone. Regardless what their gender was, their race was, their religion. And so I think when we're talking about Israel, and a lot of times now in the media, we've been compared to Turkey or Hungary or Poland and what happened there with democracy, we have to keep in mind that the reason that people are struggling here, and we see demonstrations, we've been seeing them for the past 6 months, and people still go out to demonstrate, is because Israel was always a democracy. There was no debate about that. That's the only regime we know. And basically what the government is trying to do now is to destroy this democracy. So like I said, we don't have a constitution, but we do have basic foundation laws. And we have a very good legal system. We have the Human Dignity and Liberty Act, which basically encompasses human rights. We have an Anti-Discrimination Act. And what happened with the Supreme Court, because we never had a constitution, pretty much since 1995, when Chief Justice Aaron Barak was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he and the court declared that they have the authority to strike down laws as unconstitutional if the law contradicts basic laws. Now, this sounds very controversial, but we have to remember two things. First of all, this hardly happened. It only happened 17 times that the court strike down rules of the Knesset. And it would be also very interesting to see what kind of rules they were struck down. One of the rules was when the Knesset was evacuating the Gaza Strip, Gush Katif, where there were Jewish settlers, and they didn't want to compensate them properly. And so the court intervened and said, no, they have to be compensated properly. I'm giving this example specifically because a lot of times people say that the Supreme Court is left-wing and doesn't consider all of the population, or right-wing people, or settlers, or religious people. So that was one of the times that the Supreme Court intervened and stroked down a law that the Knesset wanted to legislate. Now, as we know, and as you know from your democratic system, basically a democracy has three branches. We have the government and the legislator. In Israel, the legislator is the Knesset, the parliament, with 120 members of Knesset, and we have the court. So, and those are the checks and balances. Today in Israel, because the coalition is 64 MKs, and the opposition is only 54, basically the government can pass any rule they want because they have the majority of the House. We only have one House of Parliament. So that, in fact, because of the results of the elections this weekend, the left-wing parties, the central parties, and also it's a point to make that during these elections, it was very, very close. And basically a very big, it's actually not a big party, but a very established left-wing party wasn't able to get into the Knesset this time because they were lacking a few votes. And so really the picture of the Knesset doesn't really reflect what the people want, in the sense that now when they have polls on the media of who would you vote for, Netanyahu doesn't have the majority of the votes because it really doesn't represent what most of the people want. And even Likud voters today, I just saw a t-shirt the other day at a demonstration. Someone, the t-shirt said, I voted Likud, which is Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu's party. I voted Likud, I apologize. I think most of Likud voters, that's what they say. And even the Likud party, which is in power, most of them didn't know about the legal coup, about the legal revolution. They didn't understand in depth that this was what the government was planning. So like I said, there are 120 MKs, legislators, and there are 31 ministers. That's the government with a lot of ministers, and out of them, there are only 5 women. It's the Knesset with the least women in power. We have no CEOs in government offices because they were pretty much all fired or replaced after the elections. The past Knesset, the Knesset before, had 27 ministers, 9 of which were women. That's a third. And there were a lot of CEOs of government offices which were women. I'll also just say that just a few days ago, there's a Bureau for Women's Rights and Women's Equal Opportunity. It's a governmental office. It was just voted to be closed down just a few days ago. And this is a government office who is supposed to work for women's rights and ensure equality. Another thing they did just in the past week is that when government offices are, I don't know if you know this, but Hebrew is a language where the way you speak to him or her is the plural is always referred to as to men. So basically, when the government offers jobs, they're not obliged to by law, but for the past 4 or 5 years, the jobs were proposed like both in feminine and masculine tense of the Hebrew language. And now they've decided to strike that down, and that government, job openings will be written only in the language that is like referring to men, even though it basically refers to women, but this is like symbolizing the way that they treat women or view women, not as equal to men. So that's another thing they did just this past week, which is symbolic, but it also has a lot of meaning. So I'm going back to how we legislate in Israel. Basically, there are 2 ways to legislate. When the government, the coalition in power, wants to bring a law into vote, first of all, they vote 3 times in the Knesset. Each vote has to have a majority 3 times. And it's a very long process. First, there's a legislation draft, which opens it to the public and the government offices, and they can give remarks on a certain law, on a certain piece of legislation that is brought to the knowledge of the public. And basically, it's a process that takes time. Then the committee that it regards to in the Knesset adjourns, they meet, they prepare the bill for the first vote, receiving more notes from the opposition, from government offices, from the Justice Ministry, the Attorney General, all relevant government offices. Only after amending the bill, it'll go to the second and third vote of the Knesset. So it's a very long process. It can take months, and the purpose of it is creating wide consensus in the public, and both professionals and civil society and civil servants, they all have to reach consensus about these laws and comprise something that makes sense. So this is how it usually goes. It's a long process. There's wide consensus. They advise different government offices. What is happening now is they're trying to speed legislate, and I'll give you a few examples of what they're trying to speed legislate through MK Simcha Lotman, member of Knesset Simcha Lotman, who is the chair of the Law, Constitution, and Justice Committee in Israel. And basically, because they're doing this speed legislation, and they're actually creating a shortcut. He's not hearing any legal advisors, any counsels. There wasn't a draft of the legislation, of the bills. He's ignoring public opinion. And even when the committee does adjourn, and they adjourn for hours, 8, 10 hours sitting in Knesset listening to civil servants or public, the civil society representatives, he doesn't really listen. They don't take notes. The bill isn't changed. Usually the draft of the bill changes a few times and evolves in order to get to wide consensus. But here he says out front, I'm not interested. I'm not going to change my opinion. This is the bill. We're not changing it. And even more so, you can tell when we sit in the Knesset in these committees, each committee which legislates, like I was talking about the Chametz, so there's the Health Committee and there's Simcha Lotman's legislating committee, which was one of the most important committees. There's a legal advisor, and they always work together. And now you see the legal advisor, this is all being done against what he advises. He is not for the legal revolution, and they just ignore what he has to say. They ignore the opposition. They're basically ignoring everyone. And their goal is to take these different pieces of legislation, which I'll shortly present to you, and by this speed shortcut, bring them to the Knesset so the coalition can vote. And since they have, like I said before, 64 members of Knesset, which are whipped into, they have to vote for anything the coalition brings upon the Knesset. So so that basically, that's the way, that's the strategy that they're working through now. And like I said before, we have a very weak Knesset in the sense that the opposition has no power. And that's why it's so crucial and so important for people to go out on the streets and demonstrate, and for the media to publish articles and to show what's going on, and for public opinion to be voiced, because the Knesset has lost its power to be a balancing force against the government. So I'll give you a few okay, sorry, I lost concentration. So a few of the legislation proposals that they've suggested, and basically they've done this in a very smart way. What they want is, like I said, for Israel to no longer be a democracy de facto, and the way they do it is with different legislation. One of them is the committee that appoints judges. So I'll go back for a minute to the Supreme Court. For whom of you, some of you went to visited the Supreme Court in March. It was established in 1948. And our legal system is common law, like in Britain, and I think in the United States as well. And we have three instances. We have the Magistrate Court, we have the District Court, and we have the Court of Appeals, which is the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court basically has two functions. It serves also as a court of appeal for the lower instances, the lower courts, and it deals with both civil and criminal appeals. And it also serves as a high court of justice, where even a person can petition against the state and the state's functions. And I remember we talked about this in March. The Supreme Court receives thousands of appeals a year. They have 15 justices, 6 of whom are women. The Chief Justice, Esther Chayut, is a woman. She'll be resigning in a few months. In the panel there are 3 justices basically in in each case. Sometimes in important cases, there'll be 5 justices, sometimes 7, sometimes 9. And in very controversial cases, there'll be 11 justices sitting on a case. So like I said, they're elected or nominated by a committee, which today the committee is very professional. It comprises of 3 justices and 2 lawyers. And then we have 2 MKs and 2 ministers, which are from the opposition and the coalition. So there's a balance in the committee. And I'll say, I'm putting up a little star saying that today the Supreme Court is ruled by, the majority of the judges in the Supreme Court are liberal, but I'll also say that even the more conservative judges are completely against what's going on. They're completely against the judicial revolution, the judicial coup. And even though they can't always express this, you see this by their rulings. So it's pretty much across the board of all 15 justices are against this, and even the most conservative ones of them understand what the government is planning and what an infringement this will be on human rights and on the mere existence of Israel as a democracy. So, like I said, at present, the committee is professional, but what they're trying to do is they tried to pass a law saying that there'll be 9 members, 3 justices, but there'll be 3 ministers from the coalition and 3 MKs, where members of Knesset, where only 1 will be from the opposition. Basically, what this means is that the government will have complete power over the court and over appointing justices. Now, like I said before, this is very important. It's very important for us to have an independent judicial system because we don't have a constitution. So the Supreme Court of Justice is like the last protector of human rights in Israel, and therefore it can't be appointed by politicians. Basically, politicians want to appoint the judges, so they'll have complete power over the court. This legislation went through the first vote, but they stopped, but they haven't proceeded. It has to go through 2 more votes, the second and the third. What happened was, this happened around April, I think, and then Netanyahu, I don't know if you remember this on the news, he fired Gallant. Gallant is the Minister of Defense, who basically said that he wouldn't vote for this, and this is very dangerous. And so he fired him, which only brought up more upheaval, and people like spontaneously, it was Saturday, we heard the news, people heard that Gallant was fired, and basically everyone who lived in Tel Aviv left their homes and blocked big roads in Tel Aviv and went out to protest. And there was like even people who voted for Bibi, who voted for right-wing parties, felt that this was something that we couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. So at the moment, this piece of legislation this bill hasn't been passed yet. It's kind of frozen. So that's where it is at the moment. You probably heard about the probability cause or reasonability cause. Basically, it's a cause that allows the judicial system, the Supreme Court, to overstrike certain decisions of the government. And what they want to do is, like I said before, Israel's democracy is fragile, and the government is controls the Knesset. And under this proposal, basically, it means that the Attorney General or legal advisors won't be able to state their opinion, that if the government, for instance, wants not the Attorney General, but a private lawyer to defend something the government did to court, they'll be able to appoint a private lawyer, which is unheard of, because basically the Attorney General is supposed to, be in charge of the government and see to it that the government abides the law. So this is also very problematic. Basically, it means that any ministerial, any decision by ministers will be immune from judicial review. The Knesset won't be able to supervise over government decisions. The reason they want this probability clause taken down is because they want to appoint Deri. Maybe some of you heard the name. He's a minister at the moment in Israel. He is he's a convicted felon, and basically a few years ago the court said it's improbable, reasonable for him to run for office again because he's a convicted villain. And he promised the court, there was like a plea bargain, and he promised the court he wouldn't go into politics again. But of course, he's with us again, and he ran to politics, and he's even in the government. And so basically the government wants to appoint him. He belongs to Shas, which is an ultra-Orthodox Sephardi movement. And he basically, they want to appoint him to a minister. And in order to do that without the court striking it down, they have to pass this legislation. Also, what they want to do, like I said before, is to fire the current Attorney General. Her name is Gali Baharab Miara. She's a very brave woman, and she's also standing in the front of, blocking them trying to stampede democracy. And so basically, they want to fire her. But they know that if they fire her now, people will appeal to the High Court of Justice, saying that there's no reasonable cause for her termination, for her being fired. So basically, that's the reason they want the probability clause. What else? Let's see. I'll just kind of summarize, and I think then I'll give in pointers. I'm just looking at, I think I'll give time for questions. But I will give in a few pointers how Iraq's work is affected, the things we do at the Supreme Court. So I'll just say that if these laws are passed, I just named a few, but basically it means that all the checks and balances we had that prevented the government and its ministers from acting in violation of the law, it means that they will no longer have any power, not the Attorney General, not legal advisors, not the Supreme Court. The Knesset will be able to reinstate laws that the court actually struck down. There was another proposition where any law that the Knesset legislates, if the Supreme Court wants to strike down because it is unconstitutional or infringes on human rights, they'll need 15 justices. They'll have to have 15 justices in favor of this, meaning there'll never be a court ruling. You know, the justices today, when they rule, it's just a regular majority. There'll never be 15 justices, a majority of all of them trying to strike down a rule. So basically, it means that no rule by the Knesset will be able to be stricken down by the Supreme Court. So I think now I'll just give you a few examples of Iraq's work, and then we'll open it for questions, if that's okay. So a few cases we took to the Supreme Court. One of them, maybe you heard of, is the Reagan case in 2011. Iraq represented Naomi Reagan, who's an Orthodox author. She appealed to the High Court of Justice regarding segregation in buses in Jerusalem, where women were forced to sit in the back of the bus. And this ruling basically said that there's no such thing as separate but equal, that women can sit where they please on the bus, that it's discrimination, that it's against the Anti-Discrimination Act in Israel. We still do have that act. And basically, so that was ruling by the Supreme Court, and it's also a precedent. So lower courts will rule by it. Now, I will say that until today, we deal with cases of segregation in public transportation, but the public knows the law, the bus companies know the law, and even though sometimes there are cases of women being told to go to the back of the bus, both government offices and courts know how to deal with this, and women are compensated, and we take these cases to court and we win them, of course. So that's one example of us going to the Supreme Court. Another one is Kol Barama. I think it's one of the most intriguing cases in 2018. We filed actually a class action in the name of ultra-Orthodox women against a radio station. This was a radio station which had a no woman policy. Okay, they prohibited women broadcasters. There were no women broadcasters. Women and girls could not go on air, and they wouldn't interview women. For example, there was a professor, her name was Sofia Ish Shalom. She was a scholar from Haifa University, and she had this very interesting research about how people in high tech lack vitamin D. And the radio, Kol Barama, this Haredi, this ultra-Orthodox radio station, wanted to broadcast an item. They wanted a piece on this story. And so they called Haifa University and they asked to interview a man, and explained that they can't interview Professor Ish Shalom because she's a woman. So Haifa University declined and said, either you interview her or you're not getting the story. And so this would happen time and time again. They wouldn't interview women ministers and members of Knesset. Women and girls weren't allowed to be broadcasted on air on different programs. And this is a radio station using public airtime and airwaves. So we appealed class action and we won. And after the radio station appealed to the Supreme Court, saying that, this is Jewish halakha, and this is Jewish law, and you can't listen to women, the Supreme Court of Justice denied their appeal, and basically said that this is, an infringement on human rights, on women's rights, and there's no such thing. You can't use public radio to segregate or exclude women from the public sphere. But I think once again, and the stance of the Supreme Court was very, very clear on that segregation or exclusion of women in the public sphere is not something that Israel as a democracy can comply with. And I think this new government, what they're trying to do is to infringe upon women's rights. And we see this in all kinds of, in different spheres. I think I'll give you a third example, and then we'll break in for questions. So I can address everything you want to ask. I'll tell you that just in June it was Gay Pride Month, and in Mevaseret Zion, which is a city next to Jerusalem, there was the Gay Pride Parade in Jerusalem, and Mevaseret Zion, where there's also a Reform congregation. The municipality took out a bus, where anyone could get on the bus for free and drive to Jerusalem to participate in the parade. And so everyone was on the bus. And suddenly, once the bus driver found out that he was driving them to the Gay Pride Parade, he said, "I'm religious. This is against my religion and against my beliefs. I'm not driving them." And so they sat in the bus for 20 minutes. The person who was in charge from the municipality called the bus company, said, "You can't do this. This is illegal." And they said, "Of course." They talked to the bus driver, somehow convincing him that he has to do this or he'll lose his job, basically. And so he did drive them one way. On the way back, they already switched drivers. But that is just an example of what today is illegal. The government, that's completely illegal. It's against the Anti-Discrimination Act. You can't prevent public service to someone because of their gender or their beliefs or their sexual orientation. So this is against the law in Israel, but what the government wants to do is make it legal to not provide services because someone is part of the LGBTQ community. So yeah, I'm here. I'm listening.
Yeah, no, I want to join you, Miri, and because as you said, I think you're at a perfect time to begin to open the conversation a little more to people's specifics. And I just want to say thank you for so much rich information about, and thank you also for the amazing work you're doing in fighting for these important causes. And I know everybody did hear this, but I hope you also, you did hear this. These themes are not only, although the Reform movement is passionate about them, they are not only about Reform Jews, they're about social justice generally. And you heard the story about Orthodox women in the radio, for example. So, it's about many of these things. And so Miri, there are a handful of questions on some shared themes that relate to a greater understanding of sort of how we got here. What are the ways that we can be responsive, and some points of clarification. One point of clarification is pretty simple because you did mention it, but could you return for a very quick second to the idea of basic laws, which is that section in the Declaration of Independence, and how there is this, because there's no, please clarify if you don't mind how, because there's no constitution, it is in the hands of the Supreme Court to do a certain amount of interpretation. And there's pushback in the Knesset because of different people's worldviews or Jewish views about how that happens. Could you talk about the basic laws just a little bit more and why we have a conflict about them?
Okay, I'll try. So for instance, I think one of the most important basic laws, they're basic laws that, constituted the state of Israel or the Knesset, and they're special law, they're basic laws in the sense that you have to have a special majority in order to change them. Now, for instance, I'll explain what the court did. So there's the basic law of it's called in Hebrew Kavod Adam V'Charuto. It's the Dignity and Freedom Act. but it doesn't, that law itself does not talk about equal rights. And it doesn't talk about equal rights because they weren't able to encompass this in that bill, because when they did establish this law, when they did legislate it, Israel has a problem with equal rights for women, for Arabs. So they left it, they left it under that. It was called dignity and freedom. So then the Supreme Court read into that, saying that means that dignity and freedom means equal rights. And since they did that in 95, it's become, you know, a pillar or something that, together with the statement of the Declaration of Independence, became one of the pillars. But it's always been problematic. Why? For instance, because ultra-Orthodox don't think that women are equal to men, or ultra-Orthodox, most of them do not serve in the army. And so again, there's a problem with equality. So the court had to intervene and had to basically say that they interpret the law as also talking about equality. Is that clear enough?
That is helpful.
Okay.
That is helpful.
Okay.
The next question relates to the current government, which is, of course, in conflict with many of our beliefs on this theme. Just to remind people, those who don't know, how Knesset elections happen, but also when people were voting for their party, because you could clarify for people that people vote for a party instead of an individual, that whole thing. When people were voting for their party, did they know specifically that these efforts to overturn the role of the Supreme Court were part of the package of various parties? Could you respond to that?
Yes, they definitely didn't know. Not only they didn't know, the members of the parties, of the Likud parties, say up front that they had no idea. I'll explain. There's, maybe some of you heard of the Kohelet Forum. This is basically a research institute, which they comprised these laws. They wrote up these laws. They have a very certain ideology of the way Israel is supposed to be. And behind the scenes, they wrote this legislation and gave it to the Likud. It's, you know, it's for white supremacy. It's for Israel not being a state of all of its citizens. It's against Arabs. It's against, and all this legislation is something that was that Forum Kohelet, which has academics and researchers. They comprised all of these laws. Now, the Justice Minister, or Amir Ohana, one of the ministers, I think it was the Justice Minister, said in an interview a few months ago that they had no idea that this was the plan. Of course, Benjamin Netanyahu wants to avoid going, he's in trial, but he wants to avoid going to jail. He wants to avoid that. And basically that is why they're using this legal coup to change the system. They're even talking about changing the elections, so there'll be more years. Not everyone will have the right to vote. These are things that we haven't heard of yet, but they're like behind the scenes. When you vote for a party, relating to your former question, you can vote. There, first of all, there were a lot of parties, left wing, right wing, but none of what they were presenting out front was anything to do with this, but now they're saying that they represent the people. So I hope that's clear. Yeah.
So to continue in this theme, another question, or a few of them that came into this theme, what kind of pressure is being placed on on the government currently by those people who who voted for them and do like fall into that category or share their identities? That is to say, you know, people from within these right-wing groups, these Orthodox groups,
Right.
people who have who did vote for them, what kind of pressure is being put on the Likud and others? Are there Orthodox folks speaking out about ways this is unethical? Are they using Jewish language and Jewish law? Can you talk, do you see any?
Yeah, no, they're definitely, I think mainly in Jerusalem, we see in the demonstrations, because Jerusalem is such a special place, and also its unique fabric of society. There are a lot of religious people there who are actually left-wing or more moderate in their political views. So definitely we do hear some of that, but not enough. I will say that there are a lot of groups that have a lot of power, for instance, like the commerce or people like in business who aren't pulling their toll. They're definitely against the reform. They're against the legal coup. They might be Likud, they might be in support of the coalition, but they're against what's going on, and they're not using their power. They're not pulling rank. Probably because of financial, interests, although what's happening isn't in Israel's financial interest either. So I can say that, former Likud members like Dan Merido, I don't know if these names say something to you, but from the former Likud of the 70s, of the 80s, of the 90s, that Benny Begin, people that were former Likud people are completely against this. They'll go to demonstrations, they'll talk. We're hearing, the head chief of staff of the former head chiefs of staff of the military, which you can never think of them as left wing. They're stating things against the reform and the judicial coup. And one more thing, I told you earlier that last night, the former head of the Shin Bet, what like the Israel FBI, basically said in the demonstration, he called Israelis not to volunteer for reserve service, which is something very, very extreme for him to say. So I think like the people on the street, not only left wing, central and Likud voters, understand that we're at a point where we have to act now.
So that actually is a perfect lead in. You've kind of addressed a little bit of this, but there are a number of questions that relate to the protests and whether there's agency there, or where is their agency, meaning where is their power to bring about real change? What system or is really holding the power? You shared, and some of us were in Israel. Well, you shared how in April and we were there in March. There were these enormous, days of disruption and these big protests where finally Netanyahu backed off and said, we're going to press the pause button. But do the protests really have power here, or does, like, the idea that the military leaders would tell people, not to do miluim, do their reserve duty, could really cripple the country? Where are some of the places where, real change or pushing can really happen? Are the protests, as much as they are amazing, and you could share a little bit of your own feeling of being amidst them, are they alone really going to bring about the change, or how much power do they really have?
It's good questions. I think, first of all, I don't know if people have been seeing on the news since Thursday and Friday, people have been walking to Jerusalem in the heat. There have been like these tremendous marches to Jerusalem to get to the Knesset. And you see these amazing pictures of people from all strands of society. There are pictures of women, breastfeeding in the heat with, t-shirts and signs, and like everyone kind of understands. And we say in Hebrew, "Godel hasha'ah," I mean, how dire the straits are, and how important it is to go out and protest. And I think definitely the agency is in the people. I think that there's a lot of power in it, and I think it scares them, and I think they understand that the people aren't with them. I'm talking about the government. And I think in certain instances, it did slow down the legislation. And also now I think people feel it's absurd that this week, which is Bein HaMitzarim and just before Tisha B'Av, where, Israel, I don't know how you say it, you can Churban HaBayit and Tisha
The
B'Av.
destruction of the temple, the destruction.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So people feel it's very symbolic that they're bringing, that the government is deciding to bring the legislation to vote on this week, where people are fasting and in a period of time that in ancient time destructed Israel. So I think that on the one hand, you asked about the Miluim and reserve. So what they're saying now is basically about 1,100 Air Force, both pilots and Air Force teams are on strike. They said they're not coming, they're not going to volunteer. And so Chief of Staff has spoken to Netanyahu yesterday and today about how that affects Israel's ability to defend itself. And about 10,000 Miluim, reserve volunteers said that they wouldn't volunteer in this. Also, you have to understand that in Israel, 75% of the Israel Defense Force is based on Miluim, on reserve. And because people have to volunteer, and if they're not willing to volunteer, then it's a big problem. And I think that might budge Netanyahu. I think that's very, that's substantial as well.
Yeah. There are a number of specific questions that we're just trying to get grouped up together, but there is a really important question that is asked by a member here, by Lenny Bronstein, who asks, do you believe that Judaism is really compatible with democracy? Our Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, there is, of course, a very big question out there of whether can you really have a Jewish state and a democratic state? And this is sort of, I guess, a personal question to you about what do you think?
On the one hand, I wouldn't be working at Iraq if I didn't think that, Jewish values and Reform values are all about social justice and equality and making the world a better place and tikkun olam. And that's kind of what I teach my children. And I think, I don't know, on a personal note, I have 3 boys who are growing up here, and me and my husband, we're asking ourselves what kind of future the boys have here. And so I think, it's our calling as Jews, for them as boys, as men in Israel, to do good, to be in the front of social justice battles. And I definitely think that, yes, that's the Judaism I want to see and I believe in. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I told you about the story about the chametz in the hospital, because when, the story I started out with, when I was at the Knesset Health Committee in March, I just sat there and couldn't believe that these people who are trying to legislate this are my brothers and sisters. And I felt heartbroken, actually. I'm even tearing up now, because I was kind of asking myself, what kind of, ethos, what kind of story do we have together as people if they think that that's not my Judaism? And I actually grew up in the Reform movement, but both my parents came from Orthodox homes, and that's not the kind of Judaism that I grew up with, imposing or coercing Judaism on people and halakha on people, and it just creates more hatred. And so during that health committee where they were preparing for the legislation, I felt deep sadness, because I'm not sure what kind of future we have together when there are people that feel so differently and deeply about these values. So it's a question.
Yeah. There's Alexandra and I are trying to follow all the chat and the sub chat, and you guys are having conversations. So I know Mark Nadal, you had an interesting question and I can't find it in my list anymore. So I'm going to invite you to unmute and ask the question that you put in the chat. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, so my question was, could the Supreme Court void the new laws, saying that they contradict those foundational documents which allow judicial review?
Basically, they could. It really depends. I mean, that's why we don't want the clause of probability or reasonability to be passed, because basically they could. The question is what power they'll have to enforce this and what the Knesset will do in return. And it's a question. I can say that about 2 years ago, when people appealed against Netanyahu running for office during his trial, because he was already being trialed, the Supreme Court didn't want to rule on it. So you have to understand that it's quite delicate. On the one hand, they understand they have to put their foot down, and Chief Justice Chayut, in one of her speeches earlier in the year after the elections, it was very clear what they were going to rule, and that they were going to continue being activists and continue trying to save democracy and rule in light of democracy. But I think it really depends on how it plays out and what legislation passes in the Knesset. And also, of course, you have to appeal to the court. So it's a good question. We don't really know the answer because we've never been, presented with a situation like this. So it's kind of, we ourselves don't know. So it's a good question.
If I could just follow up quickly, could the Knesset repeal those foundational laws? I guess you said no, it would take more than a supermajority to do that.
That's true, but also they also want to be I think one of their legislative acts is for them to be able to change fundamental laws with just a regular majority. But like I said before, it really depends. At first, what they wanted to do was bring all this legislation at once, but because of the demonstrations and the lack of public support, they understood that they had to kind of slow down. So we'll kind of have to see how it plays out. One of their suggestions is that if the court strikes down a law, they'll be able to, re-legislate it. That's also one of their propositions.
I think Joel, you had asked questions along this line. I think the questions were answered because you had a number of questions, and Mark, and through Miri's questions, you have those answered. I think someone did ask about the resignation or retirement of the Supreme Court justice. Of the 15 justices, how are they currently brought into their seats? How long is their term? How do they resign or retire? And the new hope is that the Knesset will have control. They don't have control now. So could you just quickly explain how that works?
So it works by seniority. Once she resigns, I think she has to reach 75, the next justice who has the most seniority. And today, the justice that's supposed to replace her is also very liberal. And also, as I said before, even though at the moment it's a more liberal court, the Supreme Court, the way it plays out, even the more conservative judges understand that they don't want a whole new ballgame. They want democracy. They won't, even if they're conservative, they want to play by democratic rules. So they're not, so they're against what's going on. Like I said, what the government is trying to do is the way it is now is that they appoint the justices, but it's balanced. They're former justices who choose the incoming justices. They're members of Knesset from the coalition and the opposition. and there are 2 representatives from the bar organization. So at the moment, it's not political, it's balanced. But what the government wants to do is for them to have all the power in the committee, and then appoint the judges that they want.
Thank you. We have only about 10 minutes left. And so what I'd like to do in the last 10 minutes is to shift the conversation a little bit more towards the American Jewish community, and to ask you to talk about what you might want and expect from us as individuals, from us as congregations. When we were in Israel, many of us came to the protests ourselves. Unless you're in Israel, it's hard to do that. Although I will say to everyone that there are organizations who are holding protests here in our Washington area. But Miri, I wonder if you could give us other ideas about how we should engage. This has been one of those things, learning, understanding more deeply. We'd love to hear kind of what else you might expect of us. And I think that those expectations, I don't know to what degree we carry lots of our emotions about Israel too. And amongst the many things that American Jews have is, a lot of conflicting ideas. I mean, one is the fear of publicly speaking out so much against Israel that it's bad for Israel. Although, as the members of this community know, I don't always have that fear, having done it myself many times. But that is a fear of many American Jews. We should never speak out against Israel. That is something that's out there in the ether of America. But then there's also the, kind of the wedge that you are living with, that you've just articulated so well, that we're feeling too, which is Israel, less and less looks like the Judaism and the Israel we want. And so, all of those questions, if you don't mind spending the last, few minutes helping us and talking to us about, as American Jews, how we can act, at this moment.
Okay. I think it kind of goes back to this discussion between me and my husband, and him asking, maybe we should leave, maybe we should raise our children abroad. And I keep saying to them, but this is our country, we fought for it, and we want it to look, to encompass our values. And I think that that's what I felt out on the street in Kaplan and Tel Aviv yesterday. One of the speakers was saying this, you might have the power in government, but you don't have the people. We're the people. And so when you speak against Israel, I think maybe speak against the government, but speak for us, the people who I think your support is amazing. And I think being informed and sharing the stories and engaging in Iraq's newsletter, which every week there's stories about our work and about the Israel that we view and we see. And I think there's a difference between criticizing the government and what they're doing, and I think that's very, very important. And I think you have the right to do that, and I think we need you to do that. And you're our brothers and sisters, and you're our allies, and we definitely want to hear that from American Jewry, as from the American government, because we want them to have a stand on what's going on. And I think that's separate from Israeli people who don't agree with what's going on. And like I said before, one of the speakers said, you might have the power in government, but the people aren't with you. The army isn't with you. The police isn't with you. The Air Force isn't with you. No one's with you. You're there alone in the Knesset. And so I think I'd kind of separate between the two. And I think just, being informed is the most important thing, writing articles, I don't know, maybe to your representatives in government about how you feel and maybe how they can influence policy here.
Sorry, I'm going to ask Rabbi Stein to join the pictures here. By the way, did people saw in the New York Times this morning, today's New York Times, the article about, will there be an end to the financial support for Israel by America because of what's happening? Just so you know, that was in today's opinion section of the New York Times. I'll just could like run over to the dining room table and show it to you guys in a moment. But if you haven't seen that, seek that out. Rabbi Stein, last few maybe lingering questions that you've spotted, and then I'd like to end with not only words of thanks, but some ideas about resources and some ideas about other ways that we can continue to support. But I want to give you a chance, Rabbi Stein, to say a few or ask anything that's lingering here.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are kind of technical questions, but hopefully they can flesh out. There were a couple of questions about what triggers new elections in the Knesset, and sort of we're seeing from abroad that there's so much protest. So like, what would be the technical trigger and why hasn't it happened yet? And then there was also a related question sort of in the context of like, this is just very different from our own political system here. How come fringe parties have so much power within the Israeli government system? Like, what makes that possible?
Okay. So I'll address the second question first, and then you might have to remind me the first one. Because Israel is comprised from so many different sectors, Jews, Arabs, ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, left-wing, so small parties gain a lot of power because there aren't just two big parties. Each big party has to gain the majority, and so basically they need the small parties, the fringe parties. And because they need the small parties, the small political parties often, use that power to manipulate or to get more funds or to achieve more political power. But I'll just give an example. For instance, Ben Gvir, who is the head of a very extreme right-wing party that's for white supremacy and against Arabs, and is very racist. He won 15 mandates. That's a lot. That isn't even fringe or small. And he kind of overtook one of the parties, which formerly was just a religious party. But because each majority party, like I said, needs to reach more than 60 seats in the Knesset, they need the small parties, and that's what gives the small parties so much power.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And then the other technical question was just like in America, typically elections only happen either on a schedule or because maybe somebody in office, either they passed away or they resigned or they were forced out of office for like legal violations, let's say. In Israel, we know that the Knesset can have elections more regularly. What triggers the collapse of a ruling coalition, and like what causes a new election to happen? And why hasn't it happened yet, I think was the other part of that question.
So basically every 4 years we have elections. The reason we had so many elections was what triggers it is when the coalition doesn't have a majority, and then the Knesset will vote that they don't have what it's called Eamun. They don't have the majority of the House anymore. So technically they can't pass laws and they can't rule, and that'll bring to elections. That's what brought to the elections, because last summer there was a coalition of different parties, and a few members of Knesset kind of defected from the coalition and pretty much brought on what we're seeing now, because it was a very fragile coalition. It was a very good coalition for us, but it was fragile. And so because of the way the political system, because there aren't two big ruling parties, there is a lot of unproportional power for even one or two members of Knesset. It could work in our favor now. What they're trying now is for, there's 64 members of Knesset in the coalition. They're trying to convince just a few of them to defect in certain, legislation votes in order to bring down the government. But in the near coming future, we don't see elections. I mean, maybe in 2024, but at the moment, no.
Thank you so much. And then I guess sort of to go with what Rabbi Schwartzman said, we're hoping after this call, we're we're crossing our fingers that this recording worked, and so we'll send it out to people, but also we want to send some print resources as well about some of the questions that came up. And we wondered, you mentioned The Pluralist, which is an English language newsletter from Iraq that comes out pretty regularly. Are there any other sort of ways that you think that people should or could be keeping informed that you think are like great ways for us to be paying attention?
We do have, on social media, which is updated daily. So it's both Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. We have accounts, and I think that's a really, more so probably Facebook is like, that's a really good way to stay connected and informed, because also every time we're in court and there are court rulings, we'll post them on Facebook, and I think that's a good way to stay informed. And if Oli Rezlachovsky, who's the head of IRAC, or Anna Kislansky, the head of the Reform Movement, if they happen to come to the States and to go and hear them talk and speak, I think that's also a good way to stay involved.
I just, to that point, I do want to encourage everyone on the call to really actually join IRAC. You can make a donation, you can become a member. This is probably the most important thing we can do as Americans who want to support reform values in Israel. Another really great thing, many of you know that we have a sister congregation outside of Tel Aviv in Ra'anana. Kehilat Ra'anan is our kind of partner congregation. They, another real way to help people who's got, sandals on the ground, who are showing up and are doing their part as a congregation in a way that we do our part as a congregation in many social justice issues, is Kehilat Ra'anan. And you can become a, what do they call it? A distant member? No. Do you remember what they call it, Alexandra? There's a term, an international member or a partner member or friend or something like that. And I think these are two ways to make a difference and support the people who are, who are doing the work as our agents in the morass of it all. And we're really grateful that they're there when we are too far away to be the ones joining in the protest or whatever it might be. And finally, to just find the organization that speaks to your values and support that organization. As we end, because we're coming to the very end here, I just want to first offer deep and sincere thanks to you, Miri, for bringing such knowledge, and I also just personal stories, and also for the work you do every day to bring justice to all of Israel, not just to reform and progressive people. I just want to offer profound thanks from all of us to you. We might want to figure out together with Rabbi Stein how we can continue to follow up so that people really understand and are following the issues really well and understand them so they can take good actions. Finally, our conversation continues next Sunday in person with brunch. So please RSVP if you want to be part of the last conversation on this topic with our own Rabbi Josh Weinberg, who I'm sure, Miri, you know well. Josh is the head of the Association of Reform Zionists of America, and does an enormous amount of work on these topics. Any chance next week will be recorded? I think it may be recorded. It's not going to be in the sanctuary, so I'm not sure. What do you think, Rabbi Stein?
I don't know that we have a plan. I think we could probably ask Rabbi Weinberg if we could plop a laptop in front of him while he talks and record that way. So we certainly can ask if we know there are people out of town, but I don't know if we're sure yet.
Yeah, hopefully we will work on that. And I'll just say, the next Israel trip I do, no matter what the theme is, we're going to find you, Miri, and we're going to do another session with you. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I know you couldn't pay attention to all the comments, but there are many shout outs to you of gratitude and appreciation for not only your knowledge, but your work on a daily basis. So on that note, we will wish everyone Alexander, did I forget anything I'm supposed to say?
No, it's just thank you
Okay.
so much. And thank you all for being here. Sorry, go back to you.
Yes, no, thank you all for being here, and looking forward to seeing you throughout the summer, everybody, and seeing you next Sunday. Those I happen to have a baby naming just at the time of this event that I've committed to before the event, so you won't see me, but others. And wishing everyone a good Sunday and a good week, and see you, I hope, many of you next Sunday. Take care, everybody.
Feel
Thank
better
you.
just for
Thank
seeing
you.
you all. Thank you. Thank you. You're
Bye.